All right. Okay, hopefully you can all see my screen. Go ahead and full screen it. All right, we should be good to go. Perfect. So as Sarah mentioned, I am a PhD student at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa, and so I'm a student in the Marine Mammal Research Program. And I actually work at an island. So my lab is at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology, which is on Coconut Island. And so it's crazy that there are labs out here. And so there are a variety of students that are working on different topics, such as coral. We have a shark lab, we have fish biologists. And so I'm working on just one lab within this large conglomerate, the Marine Mammal Research Program. And so it's a pretty great place to study. It's beautiful, it's amazing. And this little tiny island is off the island of Oahu. So if any of you have ever been to Hawaii, Oahu is one of the most populated islands and a great place to study. Amazing marine life here. All right, and so before I kind of talk about what I study specifically, I want to talk a little bit about sound in the ocean and marine mammals and give you some really cool examples of the different types of sounds that these animals make in the ocean. And so here's a picture of the ocean, right? And so the ocean, we can use a variety of words to describe the ocean. One word that I would use to describe this ocean is very dark. It's very dark, it's deep. So unlike humans, it's very difficult for marine mammals, for example, that live in the ocean to rely on sight, right? That's not their primary sensory modality. They need to use one of their other senses, sound, to be able to communicate when sight is very limiting, right? It's very hard. And even if you go into the ocean, you open your eyes, especially in different areas of the world, it's going to be a lot harder to see. Hawaii is a little different. Our visibility is pretty good here, but in most oceans, it's going to be a lot harder to see one another, to communicate. And so one thing that's very helpful and a property of sound is that sound actually propagates or travels approximately 4 times faster in water than in air. So this is an amazing mechanism for animals to communicate and use these properties of sound in the ocean. And marine mammals rely on sound for a variety of purposes. They rely on sound for communication, so to communicate information between individuals. They rely on sound for navigation, so navigating in the marine environment and understanding where to go and coordinating group behavior. They rely on also, needing to be able to locate and find prey. So they use acoustics for that as well, or sounds in the ocean to be able to find prey in these dark, even areas of the ocean. And some areas even darker than others for certain species. And another really important thing is mating. So they need to use sounds to be able to mate with one another in the ocean and produce offspring. And so, how do we study acoustics? And so this is kind of, an overview for people that are really, really new to this work. And so acoustics is the study of sound. And so we use something called a hydrophone or an underwater microphone to understand animals. And so I have one here today that I brought, and this is an example of a sound trap hydrophone. And this hydrophone is used actually in my own research. And so it usually contains some sort of battery. It's all electrical, right? There's a lot of electrical equipment in here. And so there's some sort of battery source. And then this right here, if you can see, is actually the hydrophone, or what's recording the sounds. And all of that gets stored in this. And then when you can take this back with you after you've deployed it in the ocean for some time and be able to offload those data. And so essentially you have a lot of little sound files, right? MP3 files, or we call WAV files oftentimes. And you can put them and upload them onto a computer. And you can make these beautiful graphs of sound, and we call them spectrograms. And these spectrograms are visual representations of sound. And so you have time on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis. And so frequency, when I say frequency, it's what we perceive as pitch. So if I say a low frequency sound, that means something that's very low in pitch. And a high frequency sound is something like a whistle, really high pitched sounds. And then the different colorations here indicate the different amplitudes, or how we perceive as loudness of a sound. And so for example, in this color bar here, we can see that the lighter colors, or like the yellows, are more of the background noise. Whereas the darker colors, the warmer colors, are the louder sounds here. And so this is a variety of dolphin echolocation clicks here, which we'll talk a little bit more about next. And so this is kind of the main way that we study sound in the ocean. And there are a couple different reasons why these marine mammals need to be able to, produce sound in the environment. And so one is echolocation. So they need to be able to echolocate, to forage and navigate in the marine environment. And so how this works is Echolocators like odontocetes or dolphins, for example, they produce these echolocation clicks, these pulses of sound that are emitted out into the environment. And when they're emitted out into the environment, those sounds can hit a variety of objects. One of the main one being potential prey sources, right, like fish. And when those sounds bounce back, that information can give them a suite of information, such as, you know, what type of fish it is, where it is in the water column, the size of fish. They can get really, really specific information based on these echolocation clicks. And one of the most efficient echolocators in the ocean is the sperm whale. And the sperm whale forages in the deep, dark abysses of the ocean, the deepest, darkest places you can go in the ocean. And they feed on giant squid. And giant squid live in the really dark areas of the ocean. And so they need these echolocation clicks to be able to locate prey. And so I have a spectrogram here that shows those clicks. So what we were just talking about, these like pictures of sound. And so you can see these clicks that are occurring in the sound file. And what we're going to do now is we're going to listen to what those clicks sound like. And I want you to pay attention to the rate of clicks and how that changes throughout this clip. All right, let's go ahead and play this. Awesome. So if you notice, those clicks start out pretty slow and then they increase really rapidly. And so what's happening there is a sperm whale is echolocating. It's very directional. So they actually have to move their head back and forth. And so they're producing these clicks. And as they're honing in on prey, getting closer and closer, what's happening is those clicks are they're emitting those clicks much quicker at a much faster rate to be able to locate specifically where that squid is. And so it's pretty incredible. These clicks are very, very loud and they're very powerful. And they're able to produce those clicks through their spermaceti organ, this fluid-filled sac in their heads that allows them to really, the directionality of sound is able to propagate a lot more efficiently based on that spermaceti organ. So echolocation is one reason why these animals produce sounds. They also need sounds for communication. So whistles is a really common thing we think about. This is a picture of common dolphins, and this is a clip of what dolphin whistles sound like. All right, so very different than the clip we just heard. They're very high frequency, high pitched sounds, right? Really at the limits of our hearing. And so this picture here to the right are a bunch of little tiny spectrograms that show the diversity of whistles that dolphins can make. And what's interesting is bottlenose dolphin, which is a common dolphin that we see often in places like Sea Life Park and other marine mammal facilities. The bottlenose dolphin produce signature whistles, which are actually unique to different dolphins. And allows them to be able to identify individuals and allows scientists to identify individuals as well based on these signature whistles that are unique to each animal. All right, one of my favorites are killer whales. They produced pulsed calls, and these are one of the most common forms of communication or forms of vocalizations that they use for communication. And this is actually what I did some of my master's work on, so I don't know a lot about vocalizations of killer whales from studying killer whales in the Chukchi Sea, which is up off of the coast of Alaska, northern Alaska. And so what's interesting is there are a variety of ecotypes that exist with killer whales. So there are the residents, which are the fish-eating killer whales, and the transients, which are the marine mammal-feeding killer whales. And what's interesting about these two ecotypes is they are genetically divergent. They diverged early on in their lineages, so they're not only genetically distinct, but they consume different prey sources. They occupy different spaces. So residents tend to have smaller home ranges and occur a little closer inshore, where transients travel a lot longer and have large home ranges that they inhabit. And so they actually produce different types of vocalizations, which are really interesting. And I want you to really listen to specific differences that you hear in the residents versus the transients. So here's a clip of the resident killer whale vocalizations. Okay, and now I'm going to play for you a clip of the transient or marine mammal eating killer whales and what they sound like. All right, so I don't know if any of you noticed, but if you were really listening and then comparing the two, you'll see, and I have some spectrograms here that kind of show here, that the residents actually produce sounds at higher frequency ranges than transients. Transients produce a lot lower frequency calls. And that has to do in part by the propagation of sound. Transients are really utilizing low frequency sounds because they can emit these sounds, and when transients occur in small groups, so those sounds are able to travel farther distances because low frequency sounds actually travel farther in the ocean. So they can take advantage of that when communicating with one another and occupy these different spaces. And so it really has to do with not only what they're consuming and how they're feeding differently, but also their group sizes, how big they are, how spread out they are, and how they can utilize sound to communicate in the marine environment. All right, and then there are lots of baleen whales, which are our mysticetes is the technical term for baleen whales. And so these whales are filter feeders. And here are some interesting large baleen whale calls that we can hear. These are some bowhead calls, and bowheads are interesting because they're actually one of the longest living marine mammal in the world. They can live up to 200, even almost 300 years. And they occur in the polar regions. And here are some examples of bowhead whale calls. So just listening to bowheads, it's amazing to see the diversity of the sounds, right, that we just heard. Very different from killer whales and even very different from dolphin whistles, right? All right, and so gray whales are another example of a species we see oftentimes here off the West Coast. They often will pass by Monterey Bay, which is where I did a lot of my master's work. And they will cross on their way to their breeding grounds in Mexico. So they migrate past every year. And here are some examples of a pong-pong call. All right, and so what's interesting about the pong-pong call, not only is it very unique from anything we've heard already, but what's interesting is gray whales are actually benthic feeders. So they feed at the very bottom of the ocean, and they filter feed mud essentially to get the tiny organisms that are living in the sediment. And so what's interesting about the clip we just heard is you could hear a lot of popping in the background if you were listening kind of carefully. So not only were you hearing the pong-pong sounds, but you were hearing this almost like snapping sound, and that's actually snapping shrimp that you're hearing in the background. So even invertebrates can produce sounds, and that's what we were able to capture in this, or they were able to capture in this sound file, which is pretty cool. All right, so this is a fin whale. All right, so if you hear those sounds, they're very stereotyped, which means they're very similar. And here's a spectrogram that shows those sounds in a file. These are 20 kilohertz pulses, it looks like. And again, very consistent, very, very low frequency. But what's interesting is fin whales are the second largest whale in the world. And they're using these sounds to be able to communicate because they're relatively, they occur at relatively large distances, right? Those animals don't travel in large groups, and so they need to be able to communicate. And so these low frequency sounds allow them to do that. Blue whales are another great example. A and B type calls have been identified for blue whales. And again, blue whales are the largest animal in the world, largest baleen whale, and they use these vocalizations to communicate. And these are even lower than the fin whale. So you're really going to have to listen hard. All right, I'm going to go ahead and play this. All right, so you could hear just how low that was. And what's crazy is that sound was actually sped up 6 times. So it could be audible to the human ear. So that's not even in real time how that sound is heard in the ocean, right? It's a lot lower and it's a lot slower. So that sound file was sped up 6 times, which is crazy because our ears wouldn't be able to detect it if it was played at normal speed. And those sounds can be heard over ocean basins. Baleen whales have an amazing capability to utilize these really low frequency sounds, which can travel farther distances in the ocean. All right. And the last one, bringing it kind of back to Hawaii that I want, before I kind of talk about the work I'm doing in Hawaii, are humpback whale songs. And these are iconic vocalizations that you may have heard before. And so here in Hawaii, we have humpback whales that come here every year that migrate down from Alaska, and they come here to breed and mate and give birth to young and nurse their young here on the breeding grounds. And so I was recently actually off of Maui, which is one of the hot spots for humpback whales here. And they produce these amazing songs, and only the males produce songs. And they do it for mating purposes. They're not still exactly sure why they produce these songs, but they're incredible vocalizations to hear, and they're extremely complex. I'm going to go ahead and play a clip for you. And what's amazing and complex about these humpback whale songs is they're kind of similar to our songs, right? So we have different sections of songs, like a chorus, for example, and an interlude. And the same thing occurs for humpback whales. And so scientists have been able to parse out different parts of the song to units and phrases, and even themes. And so all these components make up these elaborate songs that can change from year to year. And so the work that I do, I kind of want to talk a little bit before we open it up for question and answer about the work that I'm doing here in Hawaii. And so my work is focused in Papahanaumokuakea National Monument. And so that encompasses all of the northwestern Hawaiian islands that are pictured here in the lower left-hand corner. And I'm also studying the waters within the main Hawaiian Islands, and specifically within the Hawaiian Islands Humpback Whale National Marine Sanctuary, which is pictured here. So it doesn't encompass the entirety of the main Hawaiian Islands, but certain sections which are hotspots for humpback whales. And humpback whales have been a focus here in Hawaii, but I'm interested in looking at a few different species and using these high frequency acoustic recording packages to do so. And so these recorders are deployed on the ocean floor for a very long deployments. It could be 3 months, it could be a year. And what happens is these get deployed for extended periods of time and are able to sit and literally just listen, right? And record information that I can then use to look at the species that I'm interested in. And so I'm looking at 2 species within the Hawaiian Islands, Odontocetes species, false killer whales and short fin pilot whales. And these are actually considered blackfish species here in Hawaii. So it's kind of a subgroup of animals. And these species are really ecologically important to Hawaii. They're resident species, so they occur here year round. And they produce really unique vocalizations that I'm using to look at the different spatial and temporal variability. So where are these animals within the Hawaiian Islands? What time of year are they there? And how do their presence change from year to year? And so I'm interested in looking at the recordings of their vocalizations to understand presence and absence and where they're really located year round in the Hawaiian Islands. And so here's an example of some false killer whale vocalizations. Awesome. Okay, here is some example of some short fin pilot whale vocalizations. These species, even just hearing them, you can hear that there are some differences in their vocalizations. And that's what I'm using to really classify these animals and to determine species without visual sightings, right? So I'm just looking at recordings that are deployed on the seafloor for extended periods of time. So we're going to use classifiers to be able to find difference in their sound vocal repertoires, to be able to pull out information about presence. And I'm also interested in looking at anthropogenic noise in our oceans. So There are a variety of sources of sound that can be emitted from humans. So any type of boat or vessel produces engine noise, which is emitted into the environment. Our US Navy uses sonar. Sorry, let's go back. Uses sonar from submarines, and that sonar is very, very loud and powerful and can impact marine mammals. Even drilling, pile driving can affect and produce sound into the environment and contribute to the soundscape. And so I'm interested specifically in answering the question of, how are false killer whales and short-fin pilot whales potentially affected by this anthropogenic noise? And so here's an example of what sonar, mid-frequency sonar, sounds like. All right, so it's very, very powerful and loud, and it occurs within the frequency range that these false killer whales and short-fin pilot whales are vocalizing, right? So it could potentially be an issue for these animals. And so this is essentially kind of my project, and I don't want to talk too much because I want you to have the opportunity to be able to ask questions. But anything I'm willing to answer, and any questions that you have. But that, I think, concludes my part of the presentation. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
That was awesome. Thank you. And oh, wait, I want to wait for Erin. Good. Okay. So if you rely on the signing, I'll, in that little portion where Erin wasn't visible on YouTube, I'll close caption everything so you can get what you missed there. But let's get into questions. So we have lots of questions here. The first one is from Danielle Wilhelm. I'm interested to know about the 52 Hertz whale, which is also known as the loneliest whale in the world. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of a unique case. So I say, when I talk about sounds, I talk about very stereotyped or very similar sounds. But obviously, just like humans are very different in how we communicate and speak, marine mammals are very different as well. And so the specific whale that you're referring to produces in a frequency range that is different and a lot higher than a normal 20 hertz vocalization that these animals are able to produce, fin whales are producing. So essentially, this animal is producing higher frequency sounds than all of his other buddies out in the ocean. So essentially, that can make it really difficult, right, to be able to communicate. And I personally haven't seen any information that's come out as to why that could be the case. And if it's just, and it sounds like it's a very unique case to this specific animal. But again, they say lonely whale because in theory, other species, other fin whales may not, be able to even, hear in these frequency ranges, let alone be able to communicate. And so it's definitely a very interesting case.
Cool. Yeah. Our next question is from Richard Gross. Since low frequency sounds travel farther in the water, are animals that emit lower frequency sounds like whales communicating longer distances than animals that emit higher frequency sounds like dolphins?
Absolutely. Yes, you hit the nail right on the head. That is exactly how it works. So essentially, animals like dolphins, for example, are a great example to talk about because they travel in small pods, right? And so they're very close together all the time. They don't, they maintain a lot of synchrony with one another. And so if they're communicating via whistles, that's easy because those high frequency sounds don't need to travel as far, right? And so that's exactly kind of how it works. And so with the large baleen whales, they often are maybe solitary animals or traveling in maybe pairs, but not traveling in large groups. And so they're having to communicate longer distances. So they're using the that sound propagation of low frequency sounds to be able to communicate. And I've even heard of a paper that was talking about the fact that, in the Atlantic, there could be a whale vocalizing along the East Coast, and across the ocean basin, other whales could hear those vocalizations, which is crazy to think about. But
that's wild. That is so cool. Cool. I know Erin disappeared. We'll caption it on YouTube later. I'm sorry about that, everybody. Let's see. So I know we had a really interesting question from Gavin, but we have lots from Miss Young's 4th and 5th grade class. So DJ from 4th and 5th grade would like to know, how many species of marine life rely on echolocation? Is it just whales and dolphins, or is it more than that?
Very good question. So actually, it's not whales at all. Whales do not. So baleen whales, I guess I should specify. So baleen whales like humpback whales, blue whales, they don't use echolocation. It's only the odontocetes or the toothed whales. So we're talking porpoises, dolphins, they use echolocation. But that's very unique to them specifically. And so they use that to be able to navigate in the marine environment. But, baleen whales, for example, they likely, again, they're not as well studied as the toothed whales in this sense, because we have dolphins in captivity, whereas we don't have humpbacks in captivity, right? So it's a lot harder to be able to study those animals. But we do believe that they're probably using calls and kind of that echo that's coming back to them, since they are so low frequency, to be able to give them information about their environment. But yes, only dolphins echolocate. So kind of a subset of the marine mammals out there.
Awesome. Gavin wants to know, how can dolphins remember the clicks to know who's who?
Ooh, that's a good question. So as far as like fish maybe in the ocean, so they're able to echolocate and those sounds bounce back. So essentially they're hearing through their lower jaw. So they're feeling those sound vibrations in the water. It's essentially kind of, how the sound propagation works and how they're able to kind of hear, essentially, because they don't have ears like we do, right? It's not like the common ear. And so they're able to echolocate and feel those bounces. And it's a very specialized ability that they have. And they're very intelligent animals. And so they're able to perceive those clicks and sounds. And there are even humans that have developed ways of using echolocation clicks to be able to look at, if they can't, without sight, if they're blind, for example. I know that there's one individual that uses echolocation to be able to navigate in the environment. And so, similar to that, they're very intelligent animals, and they're able to remember those sounds and where those different, things are in the environment.
Awesome. Someone on this list asked if there are laws around Hawaii that protect marine mammals from anthropogenic sound.
Ooh, that's a good question. So there are ways that they have tried to mitigate sound. That's kind of what I'm working on, is a part of a larger project called Sank Sound. And it's a project across all the sanctuaries, not only in Hawaii, but also, in the US. So we have a variety of sanctuaries along the East Coast and West Coast that protect species. And one thing that they're really focused on is anthropogenic noise. And so effects on marine mammals and other species due to boat noise, shipping, vessel noise, pile drivings, naval sonar, which is a big thing here because we have a huge Navy presence in Hawaii. Right. And so, what really is happening is our science is able to inform the military on like what's happening and how, sonar, for example, is affecting marine mammals, because we've seen, things as far as like strandings, which is like the most dire case, to just, maybe behavioral impacts, like maybe they leave an area when there is something going on, or maybe they're even attracted to those sounds. So by kind of doing the science, we're able to inform to kind of make those regulations stricter and really inform management. So essentially, the science is really helping them to create those rules and regulations as far as, what they can emit into the environment as far as sounds.
Awesome, thanks. Leslie Huang wants to know, can the residents and the transients communicate with each other even though their calls are so different?
Oh, good question. So essentially, those animals don't interact. So those ecotypes have been able to become these genetically distinct groups because they don't interact and they don't communicate with one another, and they don't even interact in the same space, even if they're kind of nearby or they inhabit similar waters. And so as far as the communication aspect, although they potentially could communicate, they also have kind of an added complexity. They have these dialects and different kind of, almost like different kind of languages that they're able to communicate with one another and speak. So it's often kind of like, humans, we have different dialects, different ways of speaking that allow us to communicate more efficiently, right? And, words that we know in certain languages versus the other. And so it's kind of how they operate. And so although, they sound similar, they totally communicate in different spaces. And so could they? Potentially. Do they? Probably not.
Cool. Let's see. Aiden would like to know, this is from Mrs. Young's 4th and 5th grade class. Is there a marine mammal that can replicate sound waves of other animals as an advantage to catch prey? Like I'm thinking like mockingbirds do and things like that.
Yeah, totally. There have been examples of species that mimic or pretty much take the vocal repertoire of other species to be able to communicate. And I know that was going to be part of my master's work way back when, but I didn't end up doing it. But essentially there was a case where, and this is easy to measure, it's easier to measure in managed care facilities. So if you have animals that are held potentially at like a sea life park, for example, you're able to really see those vocalizations change. And I know that there was a rhesus dolphin that has a totally different repertoire than, I can't remember the species of dolphin now off the top of my head that it was with, but it was with maybe say like a bottlenose dolphin, I want to say. And it had eventually, you know, it grew up in this environment where it was only with this bottlenose dolphin. So it was able to essentially learn those vocalizations and communicate like a bottlenose dolphin, even though it was a rhesus dolphin. And so it's kind of crazy that not only can this vocal learning happens, and then they can totally mimic other species and sound like, you know, different species that are outside of their own, which is pretty crazy.
That's wild. That's so cool. So cool.
Yeah.
All right. Maria Ruiz Blanco asks, do whales and dolphins use sound to protect their young?
Oh, I mean, definitely. They have specific vocalizations that they use, like mother-calf pairs, for example, of dolphins can communicate and have to have specific vocalizations unique to them. And so, yeah, essentially by communicating with one another and vocalizing between their group, they can definitely protect their young and coordinate with one another. If they see a danger ahead or a potential predator, they absolutely are communicating. I mean, they're very intelligent animals, so they're constantly, you know, transmitting information with one another using sound to be able to kind of be aware of their environment and protect young. Absolutely.
Super cool. We got a really great question from Krista. When there are mass strandings on shore, like lately in Indonesia or late last year in Australia, and we think that might have something to do with human-made sound, where can we find the latest information on this sort of thing? And more importantly, regulations so we can advocate on the whale's behalf.
Yeah, that is a great point. So it's hard with mass strandings because when we talk about strandings, and I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole just because, you know, you could, anyway. So essentially when you talk about strandings, so oftentimes it's sonar related. It can be sonar related. And this is all ties back to the military. And sometimes, you know, the military, it's hard to get that information as to, you know, when those events are occurring, confirmation of events. And so you really have to work closely with the government to be able to kind of get specific information. And so, you know, what we're able to do is I'm, you know, kind of working with the government in a way. You know, I work with National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, to be able to kind of identify those events to inform, you know, military. But unfortunately, I don't think, I mean, there are some reports that you can find online, but they're a little fewer and far between. I think they're still trying to get the science out there to be able to kind of inform and understand exactly what's going on. But there are reports, and I know there are lots of articles that get, you know, they get written about these topics, and people are, yeah, very passionate about it. And I think it's kind of on us as scientists to really kind of find out, you know, the science behind it and inform so they can make different decisions and either maybe not produce the sonar during migration periods of animals when they know they're going to be a big group of animals in the area. And so again, it's a little harder to be able to really make an impact in that way as like a general citizen, but by just informing yourself and understanding more about the process, it definitely helps.
Awesome, thanks. Fiona asks, I was wondering about how each picture that you showed in your presentation was captured. In many of those situations, would the photographer be in danger? Is it taken by drone? Like, how does this happen?
Great point. So some of those pictures were definitely either from a drone or taken by a helicopter. So some of the aerial footage where you were kind of looking down at an animal, those were definitely taken. A lot of them were by NOAA. So there are NOAA groups that are specifically, you know, interested in looking at these animals, since they do lots of aerial surveys where they kind of fly over doing transects to be able to understand presence of animals and abundances. Some of those were taken by permit. So again, yeah, some of those were pretty close up, right? So I work with a group called Cascadia Research Collective out here. I've, you know, volunteered with them, which is an amazing experience. And they do a ton of work out here in Hawaii, specifically looking at false killer whales and even other species, such as short fin pilot whales, a species that I'm interested in looking at. So they have special permits that allow them to get close to animals, to be able to sample them, do biopsy samples, or take little tiny bits of, their skin to be able to look at genetics. They have special permits to be able to take photos or photo ID to identify individuals and can tell us more about populations. And so, yes, all of those are taken, by permit, and a lot of them through NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which have other permits outside of the typical rules of the general public.
Cool. Awesome. Adriana from Ms. Azamek's class asks, how many whales are generally in a pod?
Ooh, that's a good question. So it depends on the species. And so different species can vary. And so there are these things called superpods, which are when you have 1,000 animals, which we sometimes see, off of the coast of California. I've known there to be superpods, and so these are usually smaller dolphins. I believe the superpod that we had off of Monterey Bay at one point were common dolphins, I believe. And so smaller animals, superpods, but you can also have animals that travel in smaller pods. And so maybe only, 15 to 30 animals. I know transient killer whales typically have even smaller groups. So their pods or groups are typically maybe like 6 to 10 individuals, and that might even be overshooting a little bit. But it kind of depends on the species, but they can definitely be in huge groups. So that's when the sound really becomes important as far as group coordination and maintaining like kind of your group cohesion or togetherness during those travel periods of feeding.
Super cool. Awesome. Yeah. Elaine Lilly asks, do dolphins ever make friends with people?
Yes, so that's a good question. So sometimes in certain areas, some marine mammals can be very friendly, and there's certain species that are notorious for being a little bit more friendly to humans. I think it's kind of like a learned behavior. So if they're reinforced, like they've been fed out in the wild, they may be a little bit more used to humans. I know that if animals are in like managed care facilities or held like at a sea life park, for example, or a SeaWorld, and say that they're, rehabilitated and released back into the environment, they may be a little more used to humans and comfortable. So they may be a little bit, feel a little better about approaching people. I think normally they're not necessarily, friendly, or some species aren't considered friendly. I know, for example, porpoises are very they don't like humans. Every time, like for example, I did some field work in Monterey Bay, we kind of get close to the boat and they disappear, right? They don't, nothing to do with us. But some species are super friendly in our bow riding, for example, right? So we'd have species that are just swimming along the front of our boat, called the bow, and they're just swimming there and hanging out, and they love it. And so I don't know, I guess I don't want to be too anthropomorphic with it and kind of push that on, but I also know that, for example, off the coast of Mexico, there are gray whales that will come right up to you, and people even, there are different rules and regulations in Mexico, so you can actually allow you to touch the animals, and the animals just come right up. And I guess it's different for different areas, but yeah.
And those gray whales aren't getting fed by people, right? Or are they?
I don't know. And so no, they're not being fed. They're just very
curious
social animals, and they're relaxed. I think they're there on the breeding grounds. It's warm. It's nice.
They're having a good time. That's awesome. That is awesome. Okay, so we try to keep these sessions to be about 45 minutes, but there are still so many questions left, and we're so glad you're all here and curious. We want to keep it relatively short. Otherwise, we'd be here all day talking about whales and dolphins. So before we wrap up, we always ask everybody the same 2 questions. The first question is, if you had the attention of everyone in the whole world, and you could tell them one thing about your area of expertise, or like one fact from what you know, what would you tell them?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think I would probably say that, that's so good. There's so many factoids. There's so much information in here. But I mean, I think one thing that's really important to remember, and this isn't necessarily like a factoid, but I think just something like a takeaway that I think that a lot of people should understand, is that, we do have an impact, and even, everything that you do can affect a marine mammal, whether that's, a plastic bag that you use, or water bottle, all that gets back into the ocean and can potentially affect marine mammals. Sounds from the ocean affect marine mammals. And so really being conscientious of your everyday life, right? So just being careful to use reusable water bottles, try your best to, do little things that little changes, use reusable bags, to kind of help, marine mammals live a better life in the ocean, I think would be my biggest takeaway. There's just so many facts.
That's a good one though. That's really good.
I just think that's like the biggest takeaway, right?
Right. Awesome. And then your second question is similar. You still have everybody's attention in the whole world, and you can tell them one thing or give them one piece of advice about literally anything. It could be as big picture, important, or silly and insignificant as you'd like. What do you tell the whole world?
Probably, I feel like it ties back to kind of my passion for what I do. I always like to tell people when I, do presentations or I talk to kids in classrooms that just follow your passion. I know that, there have been people along the way that have said, oh, you're not, marine mammals, that's, not realistic. Like, you're not gonna be able to study that. Well, here I am, despite it all. So I just think, as corny as it sounds, live your dreams. If you're passionate about something, if you like love to do something and pursue your passions, follow your dreams. It's really important because who knows, where that could take you. And so that's kind of my message. My overall message is just, live what you love, essentially, is my motto.
That's wonderful. That's great. I know when I was a kid, people were like, squid scientist, that doesn't exist. That's not a job.
Yes,
it is a job. It's a job. So yeah, I completely co-sign that. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much. All right. Before we close, we want to know where can we find you on social media if that's a thing that you want us to do? Is there anything else that you'd like to plug? Anything else you'd like us to know about? This is your free open time to say whatever you want to say.
Awesome. Yeah. So you can find me on Twitter. I do have a Twitter account. So my handle is just my name. And so it's at Brijonnay. So it's spelled Brijonnay. And I know I should probably write that down or something, or I could send it in the chat.
Yeah, we can see your first name under your.
Oh, perfect. So yes, exactly that.
And we also tagged you today on the tweet that we did about this session. So if you go to Skype Scientist on Twitter, you can find that as well. So that'll be good.
Perfect. Yeah, no, that's excellent. And then my last plug would be that, I know COVID is making things a little difficult right now as far as being able to travel, but at MMRP, or the Marine Mammal Research Program, if you, are a high school student, college student, and you're interested in getting involved, we do have internship opportunities. There are ways to get involved in science. So, please reach out if you're interested. We're always looking for good people and interns, people that are interested in, in the work that we do. And, you can even check out our website, the MMRP website, Marine Mammal Research Program, and check out all the amazing stuff, because I'm just one piece of it, right? I have a ton of lab mates that are doing some really incredible work, and yeah, so check us out.
Yeah, and Coconut Island is such a cool place to do work. I've got a buddy who works on coral there. So awesome. Cool, so amazing. Also on that island, I just want to share really quick with everybody, there's a little, not gangplank, a little walking bridge over water, and there are just hammerhead sharks just swimming every day, and it's a magical place for sure. So
totally. Yeah, and there's not every day that you have to take a boat to get, because we have to take a little tiny boat, tickets to we have every day to get to the lab, so it's pretty special.
We collect squid right on the dock on the Oahu side, right under that dock. That's where we collect.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Next time I'm there, I'll let you know. I'll be there January 2022. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Erin, for signing, even though she's no longer here. We'll figure it out. She was having some internet kerfuffles over there. But again, thank you for sharing all of your knowledge with us, Brijonnay. This was super, super cool.
Great. Thanks, Sarah.
Great. All right. And then everybody else, we'll see you next week. Thank you for joining us. All right. Bye.
Thanks, guys.